Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special two-part episode of the Teach Me Teacher podcast. The intro you are hearing now is exactly the same on both episodes titled Critical Race Talk. This is due to the nature and ties of the conversations you will hear and also the reasoning behind why I am putting out this content at all on this podcast. To start, I believe in discourse and the dismantling of echo chambers. While anyone with time on their hands or a history with Teach Me Teacher can verify my political and social leanings tend to be towards what Americans call the left, I do not subscribe to any one ideology or framework. As an educator and academic, I pride the search for truth above all else, even when such truth may challenge my own beliefs about the world and its institutions. Essentially, I consider myself politically homeless. I do not find my political identity within strict party lines. Rather, I listen to as many good-intentioned sides and sources as I can and decide how I will act accordingly. With that said, Teach Me Teacher is first and foremost a best practices podcast. It is designed from the ground up to be a no-nonsense approach to professional development for educators, and its success and reach, I believe, is because of my commitment to this vision of what PD can be for teachers and administrators. However, best practices cannot be achieved without addressing the larger issues surrounding education and our communities. Teaching does not happen in a vacuum. Indeed, it touches nearly every aspect of life. How many professions can really say that? And with such a burden comes the responsibility to contend with more than just academics. The sterilization of teaching into just being about standards, mastery, and skills ignores the vast amounts of nuanced factors that make such important aspects of teaching possible in the first place. In other words, what we believe directly affects how we act and teach. To ignore the human aspect of teaching in this way is to ignore what teaching is entirely. The following podcast and its counterpart, which are both named the same, minus the guest involved, primarily deal with the controversial topic of critical race theory and its association with public schools. Both episodes touch on various other factors and examine the issue through different lenses, but I believe they both offer nuance to the discussion that simply isn't happening in most circles today. These episodes are not meant to be set up as combatants, which is why they are separated. Rather, I am presenting them as different lenses on the same subject. As the interviewer, I tried to be as non-biased as possible. I tied similar questions to each interview, but I also allowed for each guest to bring their own unique expertise to the discussion. I constructed each discussion around each guest's unique platform and what they talk about. Whether this is an effective way to address this issue will ultimately be up to you, the listener. I'm sure there are faults I cannot see and lines of questioning I did not capitalize on, but these discussions are real discussions between people who care about education. The only editing present are quality adjustments and deletions of technical problems caused by recording over Zoom. Everything else has been untouched. As a quick side note, the only edit I would like to add here is about the data I talked about with Robinson in terms of pass rates based on race. It can easily be misunderstood because of how I said it, so I want to clarify that when I discuss the differing percentages student groups in Texas must hit to be considered proficient, I am referring to their groups as a whole, not individual pass rates. Moving on. I was upfront to each guest about the nature of how I would release these, so there is no gotcha embedded in the release of these episodes. I respect both Professor Jarvis Givens and Calvin Robinson greatly. I could not have asked for better, more thoughtful educators to be on the show for this topic. Any indication on my part of superiority of ideas over either is unintentional. This is why both episodes get the same intro and why both are releasing at the exact same time. The current debate around critical race theory, or CRT, is contentious, to say the least. Passionate educators, pundits, and yes, opportunists have been engaging in what best can be called debates and at worst flame wars against one another. My goal is that these talks, when listened to together, offer insight, nuance, and challenges to what you and I believe. My goal is to elevate this discussion past political lines so that we may come together in a way that leads us to a better place rather than circling the drain until both sides lose. Enjoy the episodes. Share them if you believe they are valuable, and bring your comments to the social spaces so that we can work through all of this together regardless of political leanings. Calvin Robinson, everybody. How are we doing today, sir?
Not too bad, thank you. How are you, Jacob?
I'm doing wonderful. We were just talking off air a little bit. Got my neighbor mowing, so if anyone hears that, that's what's going down over there. You're in the UK, so you're at a different time zone than us, so we have some lag going on, but I think we're going to make it work today. But for people
we'll
that
have to.
Yeah, for people that don't know you or kind of know, your background, what do you tell people these days? Because you're all over the place. You're one of the most prolific speakers on a variety of topics that I've seen recently. So what's kind of your own pitch to people when you say what you do?
I don't really. It depends who I'm talking to. A secondary school teacher, kids all the way from nursery all the way up to when they leave school. I was an assistant principal of that school, and then I became a school governor and director of a very popular school in central London, in our nation's capital. And then I started doing some consulting for the Department of Education on my subject. So I'm a computer science teacher by trade, and I worked with the government to try and get computer science into more schools in our nation's capital by working with school leaders and encouraging them and supporting them in whatever way I could. And I still do a little bit of that consulting now, but I'm back to studying myself now. I'm reading theology in the hopes of training towards holy orders. So a bit of a shift in direction, but it's all an expansion of the same vocation, really. It's all, continuing what I do and what I did, which is teach.
Yeah, and I think that's why, we usually, on this show, we bring on teachers in the classroom or people that have been in the classroom that are still talking about these things. And one of the big points of contention right now that we're going to dive into is just the role of... Some would say it's political ideology. Some would say it's indoctrination. Some people would say it's needed in the classroom. But what I find happening around a lot of these topics is people, they're kind of just staying on their side. And I feel like there's no meeting of the minds really anymore. And, I found you when you did your episode with trigonometry, and I thought that was such a fantastic interview. And I've been following you ever since and just kind of listening to what you had to say. And I think I think our political alignments, I think you're on the more conservative side, I'm on the more liberal side, but I find it refreshing to listen to you speak because you point out things that I think a lot of liberals should listen to in a lot of very specific ways, because here's the thing. We all have to live with each other ultimately, right? And when we're dealing with children, when we're dealing with what should be in schools and what should not be, this shouldn't be a one side just gets to decide what we flood into the classroom, regardless of if that happens to be something I agree with. So I kind of want to start this off by speaking about something that you've talked about a few times, which is kind of how the Black Lives Matter movement, kind of starting from before last year, but kind of in the summer of last year here in America, how you've seen it transition to where you are. And the reason I want to talk about the dichotomy between where you are in America, because I think this gives us a unique perspective on how political movements can start shifting what we think should be in schools, even though there might be some other contentions to be made. So could you walk us through that, just how you've seen some of these political movements rise where you are and how that has affected education over time?
Yeah, of course. So this is a big problem of today, in that we have these very active lobbyist groups who fully believe in what they're doing and believe that their approach is the right approach, but they are infiltrating schools in inappropriate ways and pushing an ideology that is, one particular leaning with no debate, with no criticism, with no challenge whatsoever. And that's the very worrying thing for me, because that is, it is indoctrination of young people. And we've seen this not just from Black Lives Matter. We've seen this over here. We have organizations called Stonewall and Mermaids, which are, more on the gender and sex side of the argument. But any time there's a contentious debate, there is an organization there that is, has a very clear agenda, or what I perceive to be a very clear agenda, that is approaching schools. because as you know, as any educationist knows, the curriculum is so well designed and so finite. We have so little time with these young people to expand their minds that we think so carefully about everything that we're going to teach them. So to just change it like that at a moment's notice, again, without any challenge, debate, or criticism, is very disturbing. But what I noticed was a lot of these schools that were addressing Black Lives Matter and, using the slogan and all of that stuff, very well intentioned, very well meaning, but they were causing a lot of issues. And the reason behind that was a lot of people didn't feel they had the expertise to teach this subject, or they didn't have the confidence to, because it is such a divisive topic. So they grabbed resources from the internet. And in the UK, the most popular teaching resource website is called TES, which used to stand for Times Educational Supplement, because it used to come with the Times newspaper. Now it doesn't. It's a whole different thing, but that doesn't matter. But the resources on that website are all very left-leaning. They're all very much taking on board critical race theory when it comes to addressing race. So what we saw was a lot of schools were teaching around critical race theory in order to get the message across that Black Lives Matter. And therefore we have, lots of kids being indoctrinated into one political ideology, and it was entirely inappropriate. So the government stood up in the House of Commons and said, we don't want to see teachers teaching critical race theory as if it is fact. You can teach about critical race theory, you can teach, all the topics, which I'm sure we'll address some of them on this podcast in a moment, but what you can't do is teach them as uncontested facts or undisputed facts, because that is not okay. And we have a law in this country. We have several laws in this country, but one of them is the Equalities Act, and the other one is the Education Act. And you are breaching both if you are doing this, because the Education Act specifically says that schools should be politically neutral. And that's up to the head teacher and the school governors to ensure that that happens. So if a teacher downloads resources without passing it through their head of department, who doesn't pass it through their senior leadership, who doesn't pass it through the head or the governors, if we're just downloading willy-nilly and teaching whatever we want, then we can become compromised, whether we mean to or not. And I find a lot of teachers are very well-intentioned, but again, they don't have the confidence or the expertise. So they download something and teach it, and they are indoctrinating through proxy.
Already, we've only been talking for a handful of minutes, and this is such a good point that I want to double down on this, because what I've discovered is, we have a really healthy audience at Teach Me Teacher, one of the biggest educational podcasts in America for teachers. And I asked teachers, what do you know about critical race theory? Has it reached your district yet? Has it come here? Has it done that? And most teachers were like, I've heard about it. Some parents are mad about it. I don't really understand it. Or I've seen it on the news. Very few people were very even kind of knowledgeable about it. So the fact that these things are getting pushed on to teachers is really interesting, because you're exactly right. When teachers don't feel confident in something, they go to the internet and they grab something that might be well-meaning, but it's going to force feed students a certain ideological standpoint unwittingly, right? And this is why I think some of the, as someone who generally supports Black Lives Matter, I've done a podcast about it, I still find contention with people that are a little bit intellectually dishonest when they say things like Black Lives Matter is not a political issue. And I think that when people say things like that, I think they're talking about just the phrase, but if the organization is most definitely political, and it most definitely has a political bent. And so this is what I'm finding, and I want to know if you can echo this, is when we use terms like Black Lives Matter, critical race theory, when we talk about anti-racism or anti-bias, any of these phrases being thrown around, I feel like a bunch of people are using these terms, and they're using them in multiple ways. So when a teacher might go, oh, of course I want to be anti-racist, I want to pull an anti-racist thing from the internet, what they in turn are doing are pulling something that is very politically aligned because they think it's something that they're using correctly. Do you find that to be true, that these terms are so nebulous right now that people, well-intentioned or not, are using them to negative effect?
Oh, absolutely. So even I don't know which one to break down first, but even the term Black Lives Matter is inappropriate in my eyes, because it should just be lives matter. All lives matter. And I know even that is contentious at this point. And people will say, well, Black Lives Matter more, or Black Lives Matter at the moment, or Black Lives Matter now. And I'm like, if you have to clarify it, if you have to add other words to it, it doesn't work as a motto. And, if someone was to say white lives matter, you would think they were being racist. And my argument is always, if you can't replace the word black with white or any other race, then it's probably racist, that you shouldn't use it. Because we all believe that Black lives matter. We all believe that white lives matter. We believe that all lives matter, generally speaking, I like to think. I don't think most people are racist. But even that's another issue, that most people, I don't think, are racist. And I do think it's okay to just not be racist. But now it's become so dichotomized, so polarized, that you can't just be a normal, not racist person. You have to be anti-racist. And if you're not anti-racist, you are therefore by default a racist, because they've made it a binary us versus them argument. Whereas if you're not on their campaign, if you're not on their bandwagon, you are the enemy and you're a bad person. And that's not how the world works. Everyone who's sensible knows that's not how the world works. But these words you mentioned, like these resources are using terms like, systemic racism and institutional racism. And these come from the idea that there is a power struggle in the West, both America and in the United Kingdom, where white people are at the top of this ladder of power and Black and ethnic minority people are at the bottom of this power struggle. And that racism is no longer about prejudice or discrimination towards someone based on their ethnicity. It's now about this power struggle. It's about this dynamic and helping Black and ethnic minority people overcome the power of the white man. And I think there's something inherently racist about that perception, because we can't just assume things based on the color of people's skin. We can't just assume that if you're born white, you're going to have certain privileges and advantages in life, because in this country, we have, white working class kids are actually near the bottom of the league table all the way through school. The white British kids aren't doing too well. And I think, we have similar issues across the States with white families not doing particularly well. We can't just assume based on their skin that they're going to outperform other minority groups, because what we do is we put everything down to race, and that's not how the world works. These things don't pass the common sense test. If we look at disadvantaged areas of our countries and look at why kids happen to be doing well or not as well as other groups of kids, we find there are many, many factors at play. It's usually down to where they live, how much money their family has, what class bracket they fall into, what languages they speak at home, how educated their parents are. Yes, their race might come into it. Usually it doesn't, but usually it just so happens that ethnic minority groups live in more urban areas where a lot of these other issues I just discussed are more prevalent. So it's a problem where if you fix a load of other issues, it would help a lot of kids, not just the Black and ethnic minority kids. It would help a broad spectrum of young people that are stuck in these disadvantaged areas. And that's what we should be aiming to do in education, help all young people, no matter their background, race or creed. And we forget about that, because the moment we focus or fixate on one individual group, and at the moment it's Black lives, when we do that, we are discriminating against the ones we're not focusing on. And I don't think we should ever do that in education. So I looked into the resources and I found, critical race theory, cultural racism, hate speech, internalized racism, intersectionality, microaggressions. All of these terms sound pretty innocuous, but they're not. They all have underlined political undertones to them. Microaggressions, this idea that you can be aggressive or you can be racist in a way that might not actually appear racist at first. It's like, well, either someone's being racist or they're not. And a lot of them come down to, again, this idea of power, and it's about white privilege versus Black victimhood. And I don't think that we should ever teach young people that they are victims, unless they genuinely are victims. I think we should be encouraging them to strive, to perform, to work hard. And at the moment, we are keeping Black and ethnic minority kids down by saying, actually, you are disadvantaged, you are a victim. I, the white man, as the teacher would say, are oppressing you, and therefore you've got all these hurdles to overcome, all these barriers to overcome, and this world, this system, this country, the Western society is against you. And it's nonsense. In both of our countries, we have equality under the law. We have lots of protections from discrimination. Therefore, unless someone can prove that an institution is racist. We shouldn't be throwing around the label institutional racism unless they can prove that the system is racist. We shouldn't be throwing around that accusation. And people will say, well, it's my experience that, the United States is racist or the United Kingdom is racist. It's like, okay, that might be your personal experience. And I'm not undermining your personal experience, or as we call them these days, lived experiences, but that is an anecdote. And as we know in education, an anecdote is not that by itself proof of a wider systemic problem. So we shouldn't pin all of it onto your personal experience. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't pass the common sense test. And again, we're educators and we're educated, so we should know all of this stuff.
I feel like when people hear a rebuttal like that, what they'll point to is, so Ibram Kendi, and people listening to this might be familiar with his work. He wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist and Stamped from the Beginning. He's one of the, the big poster children. I've heard people who support critical race theory kind of disregard him as just, a celebrity who is more problematic. But for the sake of this conversation, I'm going to use him because it's a common touchstone. But, he points out, like one of his arguments that he makes is if there are racial inequalities in the data, then there are racist policies that are contributing to that. And on its face, that seems like an argument that would somewhat make sense, right? I mean, if I'm seeing, so like for instance, I went to my assistant principal and I said, hey, just out of curiosity, does our discipline at our school, does it lean towards any one race? And he said, yeah, so we're mostly Hispanic on our campus, but the kids that get the most referrals and most disciplinary actions on our campus are Black kids. And I asked him, why does he think that was? And we just had a conversation about it. And so this would be a situation where I feel like someone like Ibram Kendi or people that kind of subscribe to this would say that there are racist policies within our campus that are leading to that. So what's your response to something like that? So when they see a racial divide in data, so to speak, is that evidence that there is institutional racism, or is that oversimplification of the issue?
What that is very clever people manipulating data. So in your school, again, we should run all these things through the common sense test. Would you say that the teachers in your school are racist towards Black people, but not towards Hispanic people? And, are the majority of your teachers white? And if so, would that make any sense? Most of the time, I would think not. When we look at our data in the UK, Black African kids excel throughout school, and Black Caribbean kids are down at the bottom with the white British kids for a whole host of reasons that I can get into if you want to. But the point is that a regular white British teacher, I don't think would be able to be racist towards a Black Caribbean kid and then not racist towards a Black African kid. They would, if they were racist, they would probably see a Black kid and be racist towards them. So therefore, it's not evidence of racism. And this is the point. Racial disparities, we'll see disparities anywhere we look in data, but racial disparity in data itself is not evidence of, it's not irrefutable evidence of racism. It might be a wider thing at play. So it might just be that there are more societal problems in the areas that Black kids that go to your school happen to have. And again, if you wipe out those problems, if you address those problems, it will help a load of kids, not just the Black kids in those areas, but it just so happens that that's, a community that a lot of those Black kids happen to belong to. It's like you could look at the disparity in any way. You could say, okay, so kids with, I don't know if you use the word backpacks or rucksacks, but kids with bags that are blue, do they happen to get more detentions than kids with bags that are red? And you could find that that's very much true, like 80% true. And you're like, whoa, are we discriminating? Is there a policy discriminating against kids with blue bags? I doubt it. I highly doubt it, because that wouldn't make any sense. And that's the thing. That's the problem with racial disparities, or any disparity. You've got to look at the issue, not the actual disparity itself. You've got to look at the cause. And, I've heard this debate a lot recently because we had a report released by an independent report that was commissioned by the government over here to look into a lot of these racial disparities. And they did find that, like the causes I talked about earlier, geography, wealth, class, location, family background, family structure is a big one. All of these had an element to play. But what they also found is that they were all the institutions they looked at, they couldn't find any evidence of institutional racism. And they did find many racial disparities, but none of them were down to exclusively to race. So I lost my track of thought there, but the point is that, we can all manipulate data. And one of the arguments people threw at me when I was like, this report makes a lot of sense, they'd say, well, in forgetting education for a moment, but healthcare, Black mothers die in childbirth a lot more than white mothers. Why is the NHS, the National Health Service, so institutionally racist? And I would say, well, again, forgetting for a moment that most midwives, or a lot of midwives in this country, happen to be ethnic minorities themselves, I genuinely don't, in my heart, but feel that a midwife, someone who's there to help bring new life into the world, would look at one mother differently to another mother and treat them differently. But maybe you think they would. So let's take a different piece of medical data. Why is it that white cancer patients die more than black cancer patients? Do you genuinely believe that cancer doctors would treat the two different races differently when they're treating cancer? Of course not. That just, again, does not pass the common sense test. There's clearly a wider issue going on here, and these disparities just manage to fit into it somehow. People just got to stop manipulating data and look at the cause of the issue.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, right? Because we could take, any number of these things, like, so to go back to the referral for black kids, we could find the data that leans towards that we could say, if we looked at it through the white lens, we could say, oh, well, I guess we're being racist to the white kids. So for instance, in our campus, you said this earlier, but it's our white kids are the kids that traditionally perform lower on all of our assessments that we do on our campus. And that is something that is really fascinating to a lot of the educators that just come into that campus and don't realize, but it's something that we even explain to, other schools that think that they don't really understand the differences between working just at different campuses with different cultural backgrounds. We're very Title I, which we serve. We're the most we have the most socioeconomic disadvantaged kids in our district at my middle school. So those factors play into it. But, we never hear that, right? We don't hear like the other flip side. It's only when it fits the narrative that there's racism against black and brown people that it becomes an issue. And I think that is where conservatives and just people, I guess not even just conservatives, but people listening to this debate, they even sometimes they might not be able to vocalize it. You vocalize it very well, but they sense that there is more to this issue than just race. And I guess this is where critical race theory comes in, and why the issue of just examining things through critical race theory might be problematic when we're actually concerned about creating equity and serving all kids and fixing our actual problems that we're having on schools. So before we jump directly into critical race theory and kind of hit on some of that, when you talk about critical race theory, what's the definition that you work for? Because here's one of the comments I see on Twitter and in the debates. People go, conservatives can't even define critical race theory. So Calvin, can you define critical race theory for us?
I can. I will in a moment. I just want to clarify exactly what you just talked about is the problem of seeing the world through one particular lens. And that's why we're seeing racism where it doesn't always exist, because we're looking through a racial lens and we're expecting racism to be there. And that is a part of critical race theory. It is, we used to ask the question, is this situation racist? And now we're told by people like Robin DiAngelo to ask, how is this situation racist? So we're starting from an assumption. And anyone that's done science knows it's not a good idea to start from that assumption unless you have a base of evidence. Otherwise, you're tainting your results. And that's what happens in these instances. But to define critical race theory, for me, it's easy. It is it's a neo-Marxist ideology. It's an offshoot of identity politics that jumps on that intersectionality ladder, and puts an idea that white people are more privileged than black people, and black people are victims inherently. And to be charitable, a lot of people will say that it's not to suggest that all white people are privileged, or it's not even to suggest that you're privileged based on the color of your skin. Critical race theory is the idea that you will never be discriminated against or held back because of the color of your skin. That's giving them some credit there, trying to be charitable about it. But even that, I don't believe is true. So where I've worked in many inner city schools, white kids have definitely been held back and definitely been discriminated against because of the color of their skin. I've seen genuine racism. I've seen real bullying of white kids by black and ethnic minority kids, because they happen to be in a minority in quite a lot of inner city schools, whereas of course around the rest of the country that's the opposite. But anyone can be racist and anyone can experience racism, and it's a very bad thing. We should eradicate it. But the moment you start saying actually only that demographic can be racist, and only that demographic can be victims of racism. I just find it bonkers that anyone could subscribe to that idea first and foremost, but you're perpetuating it. It's a self-fulfilling cycle, because you are telling young black kids that they are victims, and I've already discussed why that's harmful to them, and you're telling young white kids that they are oppressors. And how harmful do you think that is to them? When anyone that works in education knows that from the moment kids are born, they will play together, they will love each other, they'll be happy together. But as they grow older, we introduce factors that discriminate. We introduce ideas to separate them. And quite often they'll get all the way through, lower or primary school, and even partway through middle school without even realizing that skin color is a thing. And then all of a sudden it becomes an issue when we've introduced it. And if we are separating people out into these white versus non-white packs, we are making it worse rather than uniting people together under, you are all American, doesn't matter what race you are, what religion you are. That especially works in America because it's a nation of immigrants. It's a good argument to bring people together under your flag and your national anthem. That's great. That's what we should be doing. We shouldn't be separating them out and causing division. And it's much easier for you guys than it is for us, because Britain is a white majority country, and it's not. I mean, it is a nation of immigrants if you go back far enough, but really and truly, at the moment, it's not. And we have much more difficulty bringing people back together because we don't really have that support under the flag. We do have a monarchy, but a lot of people are Republicans over here as well. So we don't have the unifying factors. You guys shouldn't be in as much of a mess as you are at the moment.
This is the fascinating part to me, because I hear, and I want to push back just a little bit, just for some good intellectual discourse. So when the idea of critical race theory, and from what I've read and the people that I've listened to, and just reading kind of the central tenets, it seems like one of the major pieces of it is the fact that it's looking at the institutionalized part, right? And we've addressed this a little bit, but I want to dive a little bit deeper. So the institution, how institutions bring in race, both consciously and subconsciously. And I think right now it's really fascinating. So when I look at our data for our standards, I brought this up on my podcast with Eric Weinstein, and he was actually blown away because he didn't realize this, but our test, it splits it out by race, right? So we get our racial demographics from those. And we also have different racial pass rates. So, for instance, our white students, in order to be considered proficient on our Texas state test, white kids have to pass at about a 60% rate. They have to score 60% or higher to be considered proficient. Our black and brown kids are at about... It's at 35%. I believe I'd have to pull up the number, but it's about half of the percentage. So, and you can look this up if you look up the, and I could find the data to actually send to you, but so something like that though, right? This to me looks like, when I look at that just on face value, I'm like, this seems like evidence that there is institutionalized racism, or at least institutionalized racist ideas that are implemented into there. So when you're confronted with something like that, I know I'm just putting you on the spot here. we can dive into it, but those pieces right there are very prevalent in education, and I see it here in Texas. So what is that? Is that not in defense of something like critical race theory that might examine something like that?
So that's the opposite. I think these things have been brought in because of critical race theory. So in Oxford and Cambridge, to the best universities in the world, we're letting pupils in, or students in, with lower grades if they are from an ethnic minority background. And to me, that is so racist. That is so patronizing. Who are these people to say that if you're black, you can't achieve as much as well as a white person? That's disgusting. And that is what's known as the soft bigotry of low expectations. But I don't even think it's that soft. I think it is just out and outright bigotry and racism to make assumptions that people that are from ethnic minority backgrounds cannot achieve to the same degree as white people. Why we're lowering those expectations? And again, it comes down to this misguided approach of wanting to help and wanting to support, but it's actually self-perpetuating the idea of white superiority. And I don't think they realize that. And you mentioned there also about subconscious racism. That's an element of critical race theory that I didn't bring up either, because now racism is no longer overt. It's no longer someone says something to cause offense and that is racist. It's now either you are overtly racist or you are covertly racist, because if you're white, you're inherently racist. That's a given. That's another assumption that we make, because all white people have racist tendencies. It must be genetic. I don't know. Again, maybe it's part of white superiority. Who knows? This idea that people have certain personality types based on their race, that is racist. But to suggest that racism is now covert means you can't see it, which means you can't really ever challenge it. You can't really ever change it. You can't ever really eradicate it. And therefore, this debate, this conversation will continue to go on and on and on. And we can never win. We can never eradicate something that we can't see. Therefore, the people that are selling these books and selling these unconscious bias training courses, which is a massive multi-million-dollar industry, are going to keep making money. To me, racism should come down to intent. That's what it used to be anyway. These days, so a common one that we hear is, one of our left-wing parliamentarians was stopped in the corridor of the Houses of Parliament, and someone assumed that they were a cleaner. And, if that was me and someone assumed I was a cleaner, I'd be like, okay, that's a bit strange, but I'd probably carry on with my day. But now we've reached a point where the assumption of guilt is there straight away. People are presumed guilty first and foremost. It's no longer presumed innocent until proven guilty. It's the other way around. You're presumed guilty until you can prove yourself innocent, but you can never prove yourself innocent, because if you're not overtly racist, you're covertly racist. So there is no innocence. That's gone for white people. But now the assumption, if I was a parliamentarian and someone assumed that I was a cleaner, I would think, okay, so maybe I'm dressed quite scruffy today. Maybe my hair isn't done well. And then I'm making assumptions about cleaners. Or maybe it's just that I came out of a door that the cleaner usually comes out of. Maybe they've seen me around before and saw me holding a bucket for the cleaner or something. Maybe I look like one of the cleaners, facial expressions or something. Maybe I have the same personality type. Whatever. There could be a whole host of reasons. We could assume anything. But to assume it's racist, I think puts the onus is on us. Then that's our issue. Again, that's looking at the world through a racial lens, and it takes intent out of it, because the person who said it, what was their intention? Were they trying to greet you kindly and politely? Were they being a nice person? If so, where is the issue? If they were trying to discriminate against you, say, actually, no, you can't come in here because you're a cleaner, or actually, you know what, you're black, so you must have a lower status job than a parliamentarian, then there's an issue. But we don't know that. We can't make that assumption based on what was said. And that's the issue I have, that looking at the world through a racial lens, as well as assuming that everyone that's white is racist, as either overtly or covertly, is critical race theory is racist.
It's interesting that you bring up that, those percentages and how they're set here in Texas, that is a response from the other side, right? Because you could look at it and go, oh, this is clearly just something that they put in as kind of a racist idea. But no, it quite likely was put in because of people saying, oh, well, we have to change these percentages so we can serve everyone right. But it's like, oh, just pat them on the head and say, you're going to do great. You just need to make a 30%. You just need to hit that 30% mark versus the 60% mark. And that's an interesting flip. So to add another thing to this before we cycle around to the legislation side, which I think is the hottest contention point, at least here in America, which is the other thing for institutional racism that I've heard in one of the arguments kind of for the critical race theory side is they bring up ideas such as, from the 1970s to the 90s, we had a bunch of legislation come through America that basically changed so many things for Black Americans in the positive, right? They increased in a lot of different ways. Their job opportunities increased. And then you look at just the history of America, and they bring up how if at the foundation of American tenets and for a large part of our history, Black people weren't even considered fully human for a lot of it, how could that not have repercussions through institutions? And I was curious, is there a parallel where you're at, or is this an American thing that we do have to contend with when we're talking about these issues?
Yeah, so there is a lot of difference between the UK and the US in that sense, because over here, we haven't really had segregation. We haven't really had the civil rights movement. We haven't really needed any of that stuff because, so my father's family are from Jamaica, and they were invited over here during the 50s, a period we call Windrush, when, the Britain, the motherland, so to speak, invited people from the Commonwealth countries, former colonial parts of the empire to come to the motherland to work because they needed labor. And so it was an invitation. And it was very much people were already part of this family of nations. So Jamaica is a Commonwealth nation, former British colony, and people there, generally speaking, are proud to be part of the Commonwealth. They'll have the Queen on the wall and things like that. So my father's family were very happy to come here, and they experienced some racism on an individual level, but it was never really systemic in this country. People were invited over here to work, so they had the right to work, and it's a very different argument over there. But I think a lot of this comes down to how obsessed we've become about race. So both countries have moved such a long way. We've made so much progress over the last just couple of decades, but maybe the last century, we've made so much progress, and we don't really celebrate that either. We kind of just assume that everything's as bad as it's always been, and it's definitely not. We've come a long way. So we need to first of all celebrate that progress, but then we need to move past it. So if we truly want equality, we want everyone to be treated the same. And this comes back to what I was saying about kids, in that kids will thrive if you set high expectations for them. All educators know this at heart. And the moment we lower standards for certain kids, we're limiting them. If we remove those glass ceilings and raise aspirations for every single individual in our classroom, they will see the benefit of that. So we want to treat kids equally. And that doesn't mean equity. That doesn't mean they're all going to start from the same place, but we're going to give them the best possible chance that we can. And also, if we want true equality, we have to stop talking about race, I think, eventually, because we don't want to promote certain groups above other groups, because that's not equality. We want everyone to be the same. Therefore, race has to become less of an issue in our society in general, and we're obsessed with it right now. And if we stop, again, dividing people into these, because race is a social construct, it was made up. The race that we talk about at the moment, it was pretty much categorized during the transatlantic slave trade to kind of differentiate for a lot of negative connotations. But before that, if we go back to the Middle Ages, people didn't really see race in the same way that we do now, because we are all essentially one human race. There are very, very few differences, if any, between black people and white people on a biological level. So why are we always talking about it? Why don't we come back to, again, bringing people under unity of our nation or communities or families? And one way to address that societally is, we've had success over here with blind CVs, for example, in that if you see a racial disparity in an industry, instead of focusing on that particular racial demographic, as we talked about in the school, instead of focusing on black kids, so in the workplace it would be promoting a job for black people. I find that offensive and patronizing, and I think white people who don't get the job would feel resentful. Black people who do get the job because of their race would feel like they only got it because of an immutable characteristic, rather than all the work they've put in to gain the qualifications and experience. That does quotas and ratios like that don't work. Instead, if we had blind CVs and stop asking people to tick what race they identify as on forms, and just get rid of names so we can't see how foreign sounding a person's name is, and just look at qualifications and experience, look at meritocracy, God forbid, then we'd be in a much better place, I think.
Yeah, so I think this is where the legislation of all of this comes to head, right? And then this will kind of be the closeout of our conversation, because I think this is where the contention is. So I'll give you a clear example. I have a good friend who he actually taught me in high school. He became my principal, and now he's a principal somewhere else. But I asked him, I was like, hey, man, are you paying attention to the critical race theory debates where you're at? He's not too far from here. And he goes, man, they're already talking about it. So he is a black principal who works in a predominantly white community. And there's a Facebook group, for instance, that is incredibly against critical race theory. It's a lot of parents. There's someone running for the board of education who is almost purely running on this anti-critical race theory stance. And they're calling a lot of the equity work that they've done critical race theory. They're pointing out, it's wild to watch a lot of people bring this stuff, and it's definitely a huge push for people saying no critical race theory is bad, it's indoctrinating kids. And then we have legislation coming out in places like Texas, among other states, that are basically, on Twitter, when people talk about this, they're like, well, we're banning critical race theory. Then you read the laws, and it's really, the laws, I feel like, are talking more about you cannot compel teachers to teach certain ideologies, or certain being forced to speak about something in specific ways. And I think this is where I want to ask the question to a conservative and say, I feel like a lot of this anti-CRT legislation that's coming down, at least here in America, it feels like a lot of it is the conservative equivalent of virtue signaling against critical race theory, when I feel like we already have a lot of this in place to not have teachers indoctrinate. So my question to you is this political posturing, or is there a real reason to outright ban critical race theory? Because anytime we're banning something, as an English teacher, that's when my signals go up, because I'm like, why are we banning books? Why are we banning things? Why are we banning ideology? So what do you think? Is it worth going to that extreme? Is it that dangerous that we need to be legislating anti-CRT?
Right. So good question. And I'm very afraid of banning anything as a conservative. I think it's very worrying when we get into banning territory. But I don't think it was banning. I think, so for example, Donald Trump, and I'm bringing up his name, apology to all the teachers that are freaking out and getting triggered right now. But regardless of what you think of him, and I know it's difficult for many people because we live in such a polarized society right now. It's very difficult for many people to get past that. But if you can put aside the man for a moment and look at the executive order that he put in place, this executive order combating race and sex stereotyping. I mean, just that sentence alone makes sense. But it's some of the best legislation I've ever seen. The moment Biden got in, he repealed it straight away. And I find that very worrying, because politics has become so partisan at this point. It's not even about the cause. It's not about helping minorities or anything like that. It's all about political points, and it's so frustrating. But what this executive order did is it said you cannot stereotype based on race or sex. And I love that, because that's not banning critical race theory. That's not what the executive order did. All it did is it stopped you from stereotyping people based on their immutable characteristics, the things about themselves they cannot control, they do not choose, and therefore should not be judged on. And I love that. There's nothing more wholesome about than that. And all liberals, conservatives, everyone should be supportive of that measure. And it's disgusting to see it ripped apart. But what this did is, it combated critical race theory in the way that if you are a university and you said, we are institutionally racist, we apologize to all our black students because we are racist, we need to work harder because the white man is evil, whatever. If you said something like that, your funding would be cut. So it's like, okay, if you're racist, we're not going to fund you as a public institution. Why should we not going to fund racist institutions? And then all of a sudden we saw them standing up saying, well, actually, we're not racist. What we meant by that was that we can all do a bit better on. So it gets rid of this rhetoric and it moves things back towards evidence, which is what we should be looking at in education. We shouldn't be, again, making assumptions that we're racist. We shouldn't be just presuming that white people are guilty or that black people are being held back. What we should do is look at racial disparities, look at the causes of the disparities, and we should never stereotype based on immutable characteristics. And, you've got some great campaigners out there, Chris Rufo and James Lindsay, who've helped shape this direction in education and helped shape this legislation. But it should always be about removing barriers, removing hurdles where they exist. But first of all, let's have a look, see if there are any. First and foremost, as a black teacher myself, people will often say, "Well, we need more black head teachers. Why are more black people not becoming head teachers?" And people make assumptions and say, "Oh, it's because it's not easy enough for them to become head teachers, or we make it too hard for black people to become head teachers." And it's the assumption, like, why would it be more difficult for a black person to become a head teacher than a white person if we have the same qualifications and experience in school? You're making the assumption that all black people that are teachers want to become head teachers. Well, why? What if in a black African community, aspirations are set higher than head teachers, and they spend some time in school and then become, corporate bankers or something. I don't know. There could be anything behind it. My point is, let's not make assumptions. Let's actually see if there are barriers before we put silly measures in place to get rid of barriers that don't exist, like quotas and ratios. And let's instead flip it on reverse to get rid of stereotypes based on these immutable characteristics, which is something that, for all his faults, and he has many, this is something that Trump actually managed to do well, and that's been unfortunately ripped out by the Democrats.
Without a doubt, there are people listening to this who are completely, they listen to critical race supporters. They listen to people doing anti-racist work. They listen to all of this. They have been bought into it. If you were going to say anything to them that might cause them to break outside of their echo chamber just to get to something else, what is the one thing that you offer people that might already be not indoctrinated? I feel like that has a negative connotation. I don't feel like the listeners of this show are indoctrinated into that, but it might just be what they, we said at the top, they believe they're doing the right thing. They believe this is the way to solve the problems that we see in education. What would be your kind of the linchpin, so to speak, to just crack the dome of critical race theory thinkers and to get people to look outside and beyond this ideology that they've subscribed to?
I think it's very difficult because of the cognitive dissonance at play. But I would say, as an ethnic minority person myself, I'm not a victim. I'm not oppressed. I live, the West is the best place to live in the world for a whole host of reasons. We believe in democracy. We believe in tolerance of people with different faiths and none. We believe in the rule of law. We believe in a lot of good, positive things in America and in the UK that a lot of the rest of the world don't support. And we should promote those things. We should encourage those things, not just around the world, but in our own countries. And we should never assume that someone is oppressed or a victim unless they tell us so. So we shouldn't be self-perpetuating. We shouldn't be accusing people of being a victim or accusing people of being an oppressor. In the United States, you had a black man as your president. In the United Kingdom, we've had 2 female prime ministers. We've now got a mixed race member of the royal family. Not that we're a fan of hers, but that's a different issue altogether. Nothing to do with her race. But in Western society, you can become anything you want to become if you work hard enough at it. Yes, we don't live in a complete meritocracy. You do have to make the right connections. You have to network as well, because of course the world is slightly nepotistic. But that doesn't mean you can't do it. And we should be teaching kids that they need to buckle down, work hard, and they can become whatever they want to become. That's the message we need to be sending home. We don't need to be telling them that they're victims. We don't need to be telling them that they're held back and they will never achieve, because they will start to believe it if you tell them that often enough. So let's flip the negative into a positive. And remember that the West, the UK and the US are 2 of the best countries in the world to live for anyone. Whatever gender, race, religion, doesn't matter. I can think of far, far many worse places to live. So let's encourage positivity and unity. And again, come back under that banner of, you're all American. That's what brings you together. Sing the national anthem together. Celebrate your qualities that you share more than focusing on the things that separate you. And I honestly think identity politics and critical race theory and all these things, as well-intentioned as they might be, they separate us based on characteristics that we can't control. And I don't think that's ever helpful.
Calvin, if people wanted to find you, follow you, keep in touch with your work, how do they do so, sir?
I say Google me because I don't want to give up my... Well, because my Twitter is at Calvin Robinson, but I could get banned tomorrow for having an inappropriate opinion at the moment. So I'm on Telegram, Twitter, Facebook. It's all Calvin Robinson.
And that is it for this episode, you guys. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Like I said at the top, this is just part 1 of a 2-part conversation. Do not listen to just one side. The whole point of this experiment of putting together 2 great minds, of bringing such a hot topic to the podcast, is so that we can listen to one another and learn. So go check out the other episode if you do not, whichever one you clicked on. But while I have you here, you guys, I want to thank you for listening to this podcast. If this is the first time you've ever listened to Teach Me Teacher, we do a lot here. We cover so many topics and whatnot. I'm an English teacher, so there's a lot of literacy focused stuff here, but we also talk about some broader topics. We talk about science, math, engagement, assessment. We've hit it all at this point of 5 years into this podcast. So go check out the backlog. If you are interested in content like that, hit subscribe. We release an episode every single Monday. This is the season between seasons, just so you know, which is why we're doing some things a little bit different here in the summer. But season 6 is about to drop here in the coming weeks. So you guys, there's going to be so much content coming. So subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you enjoyed this, if you learned something, if you feel like this type of content is valuable, valuable, do me a favor. Leave a review or a rating over there on your podcast app of choice. We're almost up to 400 reviews. The majority of those are 5 stars, so thank you guys for that if you've already supported. But if you haven't, go support it. That is one of the best ways to support the show so this show gets elevated in the wonderful algorithms of the world. You can also support my work if you are in need of some inspiration or want to learn about the impact schools had on me. My first book, it's called Teach Me Teacher. You can find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever. It's about my personal story about how schools and teachers saved me by proxy, and guided me into such a fantastic world away from drugs and violence that I grew up in. So go check out that book if you want to support my personal work. Share this, subscribe. I will see you guys next week for another fantastic episode. And then we are off to season 6. I can't believe it. I hope you guys are staying safe. I hope you're staying educated. I hope you are enjoying the summer. Educators, students need us, parents need us, communities need us. So stay fresh and keep learning, you guys. And as always, have a good one.